Chapter number 6, Unitive Contemplation, Dhyana Yoga. Now we continue with the dialogue. We have to remember that the Bhagavad Gita is a dialogue, a samvada. And so Arjuna now raises some doubts that are in his mind regarding the actual practice of the kind of yoga that Krishna has been extolling until now. We must remember that this is also a battlefield, and so Arjuna is quite conscious of the fact that he could be killed. What then will be the result of his yoga practice? Supposing somebody is unable to continue with yoga practice, what is the fate of such a person? That is the kind of question that he now put. So Arjuna now raises the doubt. Verse number 33. Yo vayam yogastvaya proktaha samyena madhusudana etasyaham na pashyami chanchaladvad sthitam sthiram. That yoga you have outlined as constituting of sameness, O Madhusudana, I do not see for this any stable foundation owing to changefulness. So here now the device of a samvada, a dialogue, is resumed, because the Gita is a dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna. So here Arjuna presents himself as the anterior skeptic, person who doesn't quite readily agree with the kind of yoga that Krishna is trying to teach him. The device of a Purvapaksin and Siddhanta is one of the methodologies of wisdom. The student who approaches the teacher usually represents the Purvapakshin. So that person's mind is full of prior prejudiced or unexamined notions with which he is confused. And that was the case of Arjuna too in the first chapter. He displayed his ignorance or his lack of proper understanding, though he presented it as if he was a very concerned person. So that showed his Purvapakshin nature, his anterior skeptic. And Krishna's job, like any wisdom teacher, is to remove those wrong notions in Arjuna's mind and to provide him with finalized, authoritative and correct teachings. That is the Siddhanta. So in this verse number 34, Arjuna is thinking of peripheral aspects of consciousness where control is very difficult. So the mind has three qualities. It is chanchala, changeful. It is pramathi, it is agitated. And it is balavadridam, it is forceful, it is imperative. So in Buddhist literature, it is said that the mind is like a restless monkey. A restless monkey that is sitting on a hot tin roof. A restless monkey that is sitting on a hot tin roof and who has consumed alcohol. So that is the extreme form of the agitated mind. And from this agitated mind, we are trying to bring it to a calm center through a focus, which is the yogic method of silencing the mind and bringing it to its own foundation and bringing it to quietude. That was compared to the flame burning in a windless place. The mind has no distractions and no disturbances. And in Vedantic texts, it is often compared to a bee that is sucking the nectar in a flower. So it is so absorbed in its own bliss that it does not get any distractions. On the contrary, the mind that has moved to the periphery will be constantly agitated. So like the wind, he says, like the wind in chapter number 267, he talks of the gale, the wind carrying away the mind as if a ship in the waters. So that's a very apt description, because the wind has no center and it is easily distracted, whereas the mind needs a center to be focused. And usually when the mind is involved in something very interesting, it naturally gets a center and it is not distracted. So the mind has what is known as a centrifugal tendency. The mind tends to draw you outward. Number 34. Chanchalam hi manaha Krishna pramati balavad dridam tasyaham nigraham manye vayurivasu dushkaram. The mind is changeful indeed, O Krishna. It is agitated, forceful, and imperative in character. Like the wind, I consider its control very difficult. So Krishna has no other option but to agree with him. Sri Bhagavan Uvacha, Asamshayam Mahabaho Mano Durnigraham Chalam Abhyasena tu kaunteya Vairagyena cha grahyate. Krishna said, doubtless, O mighty armed Arjuna, the mind is difficult to control and changeful. By practice indeed, O son of Kunti, Arjuna, and by dispassion it is held together. To bring the mind under control, we need dispassion, not to be influenced by strong emotion and so able to be more rational and impartial. When emotions come in, then a person becomes irrational and impartial. Now raga, anuraga, vairagya. The word used here is vairagya, having no raga. Raga is an emotional coloration. So he says the one thing you need is vairagya, dispassion. Raga is the opposite of vairagya. Raga means an emotional coloration. Anuraga is when a person is interested in and involved and absorbed in some interesting activity or work, then it becomes anuraga. And vairagya means it's dispassionate. The second advice he gives is abhyasa, practice. Abhyasa, by repetitive practice. But what is the practice that is given in the Bhagavad Gita? We know that if we start learning to play a musical instrument, in the beginning it's very difficult. The fingers don't quite fall in place. There is pain in the hand, pain in the shoulders, and the rhythm doesn't seem to match. But over time, by practicing over and over again, one becomes quite an expert and a good musician. In the case of Gita practice here, in this Bhagavad Gita, what is the practice that he is talking about? The actual mention of any kind of yogic practice or Hatha yogic practice, there is only posture that is mentioned. And even there, the posture that is mentioned is only to sit erect, sit with head and neck and back erect. That is in chapter number 5, verses 10 and 11 and 12. So here the practice is a little bit different from Patanjali Yoga. So we see that in chapters, verse number 25 and 26 of chapter 5, where he speaks of slowly, activity should be brought to a standstill by reason steadily applied, establishing the mind reflexively in the self without thinking of anything whatsoever. Shanair is the word used. Slowly, over a period of time. So this is not something that can be accomplished with any haste. It requires many years of gradual practice, consistent practice, to bring the mind to a certain stillness, to take the mind away from its peripheral involvements, to bring and establish vairagya and abhyasa. Verse number 36. Asamyata atmana yogo dushprapena iti me matihi vyashatmana tu yatatta shakyo avaptum upayatah. By a self uncontrolled, yoga is hard to attain. Such is my opinion. But by a self which is its own support, endeavoring, it is possible to reach through the means indicated. So here self-control is not a moral discipline, stoically applied, that you will not allow the mind, you very mechanically and stoically control the mind. It's not in that sense. Neither discipline is of the nature of severe austerity. We must understand that this is the great revaluation of yoga or austerities and spiritual practice by the Bhagavad Gita, which allows a certain amount of joy and happiness in the spiritual process. We know from stories of medieval monks in wearing sackcloths and whipping themselves and torturing themselves basically. That kind of yoga is not recommended in the Bhagavad Gita. There is a certain joy that is to be accompanied. The yoga practice should bring certain amount of joy as well. So it talks of self-control, but self-control through an interesting way, not through a brutish way. Arjuna uvacha ayatihi shraddhayopeto yogaschalati manasaha aprapya yoga samsiddhim Kam gatim Krishna gacchati. Verse number 38. Kachinno bhaya vibhrashtas chinnabhram iva nashyati apradishto mahabaho vimudho brahmanah pathi. Arjuna said, for he whose mind, unsubdued but endowed with faith, has deviated from yoga, not reaching to yogic attainments, what path does he take, O Krishna? Is he not fallen from both sides like a riven cloud, destroyed without a mainstay, O mighty armed Krishna, confounded regarding the path of the Absolute? So Arjuna is also a Purva Pakshin, an anterior skeptic. So right from chapter 2 onwards, chapter 3 as well, we have noticed that he continuously questions the teachings of Krishna. It is only later, after the 11th chapter, after he has a Vishvarupa Darshana, that this kind of skepticism or doubt is cleared from his mind. So in the Upanishadic context, it is always a Purva Pakshin and the Siddhanta. Purva Pakshin is anterior skeptic. He or she is a skeptical person who doesn't straight away agree with the teachings that is given to him, but raises several doubts. The teacher then presents the Siddhanta, the final teaching. So in this case too, we have just seen Krishna speak about the self-controlled yogi and the high state to which this yogi is able to go in terms of his consciousness. But this teaching of Krishna is once again doubted and questioned by Arjuna. So the intentions may be good, the intentions are correct, but due to circumstances and due to some deviation on the part of the yogi, that person is unable to pursue the path. What then is such a fate? So Gita's contribution to yoga is its sameness, the yoga of sameness, balancing or cancelling out of counterparts. Our experience is always composed of counterparts. In Nicholas of Cusa, a European philosopher, he called it the coincidence of opposites. It is such coming together of two opposite forces that creates our experience. So dark and light must come together to give us the experience of an object. Heat and cold must come together to give us our experience of the environment. So the yogi understands that all of this phenomenal manifestation is the coming together of opposites. We know that in political science also, Marxism brought in the dialectics of the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. And Marx got this idea from Hegel, who introduced dialectics. But Hegel used it in the sense of a historical process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Marx used the same idea, that it is two forces that are in opposition. The forces of the exploitation, which is wielded by people in power, and the exploited masses, which is the proletariat. But the basic idea is this coming together of two forces which are really opposite in nature, and the interaction of those two opposite forces creates our experience. But yoga is a process when this opposite nature is cancelled out and a balance is brought. So this secret of yoga, which when mastered, allows a person under every circumstance to cancel the polarities and come to the neutral center, and thereby bring harmony by recognizing the dialectical counterparts in every situation. So this is operating at a more fundamental level, at the surface level of the mind, where consciousness functions as the mind. Then there is a splitting of consciousness by the senses and also by the operations of the mind, the thought process. And therefore it is very difficult at the periphery to apply any kind of yogic balancing. Therefore one withdraws, goes inward, learns to withdraw the senses from sense objects which cause a diffraction or which cause a splitting of consciousness into many fragments. Or you can say consciousness is fragmented at the peripheral level and concentrated in the center. And the more concentrated it becomes, as the word itself suggests, con-centered, you become more centered. And the more consciousness becomes fragmented in sensory stimuli and sensory experience, the more a person gets a feeling of fragmentation. This changefulness. So the mind is considered to be chanchala, or restless, constantly in motion, changing all the time. And we have a similar reference in chapter 2, verse 67, where mind is compared to a boat which is drifting and blown away by the wind. Or the wind is a good example of distraction, because there is really no center for the wind. But the mind needs a center. And it is bringing oneself to one's center that is the object of contemplation.